We now get to one of my annual most favorite moments in the Encore gathering, which is when we honor our founding board member, John W. Gardner. John Gardner was really the inspiration for the Purpose Prize. In 1964, he won the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the ultimate gold watch you get after you've done all your most important work. But in fact, he was only getting started. After he got that award, he served as Lyndon Johnson's Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare from 1965 to 1968, during which period he implemented Medicare, the Older Americans Act, the Elementary Education Act, and so many other breakthroughs. He went from that period, he had already created the White House Fellows Program. He left government to start Common Cause, independent sector, and all along he had the idea for Experience Corps, which he put out in public in the first editorial ever done by a non-AARP CEO in what was then Modern Maturity magazine, describing what he called Operation Give Back for older people. Encore would never have existed if it wasn't for John Gardner. When we had created Experience Corps, carrying out his vision, I went to see him about the idea of launching an organization to help advance that program, and he agreed to join the board and recruit others, and he also agreed to help us raise money for the new organization. And there was a significant event in that. He took us out to see the head of Atlantic Philanthropies and told him that he had to give us a lot of money. And at the dinner, Joel Fleischman, then the head of Atlantic, said, well, John was the closest thing to infallibility in the social sector, so he would follow that instruction. And on the way home from that meeting, which was, John was in his 80s at the time, he had cancer, he was really in a lot of pain. And I had a Volkswagen Beetle, and we were driving home on Highway 101 from this meeting in San Mateo back to John's house at Stanford. And we were zipping along in the night, and I thought, wow, this is a great opportunity to ask an extraordinary person about his life. And I asked him what was most significant about his life. And as he was talking, I became so engrossed in this tale that in his tales, that I neglected to notice the tail lights that were accumulating rapidly in front of us. And I slammed on the brakes of this Volkswagen Beetle, which started skidding forward. And John had his hands on the dashboard, and he was repeating one phrase over and over again. It was the phrase, "Oh my God." I simultaneously had a phrase repeating in my head, which was, "You're killing a national treasure." And I think the only reason we survived is maybe that old adage about your life passing through your mind before you die. You know, if it would just been mine, we would have been goners. But John had so many things that had to go through that we had enough time to come to a peaceful halt. Every year we honor John. He never drove with me again. In fact, for a period, he refused to walk on the same sidewalk. He'd cross over very elegantly to the other one. We've honored John with this award and lecture every year. Extraordinary winners, Sandra Day O'Connor, Bill Drayton, Jim Joseph, Tom Tierney. I could go on and on about the great people who we've honored in the past. But I feel particularly moved by this year's Gardner lecturer, which is Carol Larson, the founder and CEO of the David and Lucile Packard Foundation, and somebody who I think embodies John's spirit more than anyone I've ever met. And she reflects John's life in her own extraordinary accomplishments. Not only is she leading one of the biggest foundations in the world and has done so for over a decade. I was recently going through the airport and I picked up a copy of Foreign Policy magazine with the cover story on the 100 most powerful people in the world, and there was Carol. She was board chair of the Council on Foundations, and she's done so much to advance the causes that Packard is deeply committed to, and to advance the work of Encore, even though that's not something that Packard is focused on as an institution. It's been her deep personal commitment. In fact, the idea of having an Encore convening annually came from Carol. But even more than the wonderful resume that she shares with John, she shares a humility and a wonderful sense of humor. And so I'm particularly honored that Carol accepted our invitation this year, and I want to welcome my friend and mentor, Carol Larson.
You get to see the magic of technology here. Well, it is truly an honor to be here. I have been probably to most of the conferences that you've held, and it really took my breath away to be asked to give the 7th talk, remembering John Gardner and his living legacy, because he still influences us so much today. But I thought you should hear from him, so I want to begin with a clip from 1990. The occasion was the 20th anniversary of Common Cause, which, as Mark mentioned, John founded and was its first leader for 5 years. And in this clip, he had just been introduced by Archibald Cox and had taken the stage to offer a few remarks. So let's watch him.
I ask that no more than 5 minutes be scheduled for my remarks. That seemed to me to be plenty of time to allot to ancestor deference. I'm not really an ancestor yet. I'm more conscious of the passage of time than I used to be. My mother, who will be 100 in 6 months, lives in the Carmel Valley, called me the other day and said, "This business of aging bothers me so I can hardly tell you." She said, "It's just terribly upsetting." And I said, "But you're healthy and mentally alert. Think how lucky you are." And she said, "Oh, I'm not thinking about myself. I'm talking about you and your brother." She still doesn't see anything funny about that remark.
That's great. For those of you who ever had the opportunity to meet him, you knew that he combined that great wisdom and humor. But actually, when Mark called me up to ask me to do this talk, I felt a little bit like this was familiar. I felt that he was almost saying to me, "You know, Carol, this aging thing really worries me a lot." And the urgency of thinking about an encore. And I felt like, well, Mark, you have decades left to go. You don't need to be thinking about your encore. And he would reply, "No, Carol, it's you I'm worried about." And so, indeed, at 61, I do identify with John in this clip when he says that I am more conscious than ever of the passage of time. And I am honored to take up Mark's invitation and begin to think about my own encore and join all of you in doing the same. But most of all, I'm really excited this morning to remember together the example and words of John Gardner, and as I said, to honor his living legacy. In rereading much of his written work to prepare for this meeting, I realized how much he had inspired me and began to think about why. And for me, I think his power came to millions of people because he spoke to us as individuals and not just about our problems in society. As individuals, he challenged us to renew, to refresh, to rethink, to grow, to learn, and he gave those same challenges to us as a society. Listen to his words from one of his most well-known books on self-renewal. He focused again on the person. He saw them inextricably linked to the power of society. He wrote, "The source of creativity of society is in the person. Renewal springs from the freshness and vitality of individuals, men and women. Unless we foster versatile, innovative, self-renewing men and women, all the ingenious social arrangements in the world will not help us." Renewal of the individual, renewal of society. I also think that we were inspired by John because when he spoke, you could see it even in that light clip. When he spoke both from the mind and the heart. He described himself, I love this one, he described himself as a tough-minded optimist. Tough-minded, clear-eyed for sure, saw some of the most serious problems in society when he was Secretary of HEW and beyond. He was clear-eyed about the facts. He was clear-eyed about the problems. He was a good analyst. He spoke from the mind. But he was fundamentally an optimist, rooted in hope, seeing possibilities, speaking from the heart. Indeed, in the midst of his tenure as Secretary of HEW in the Johnson administration, in the midst and turmoil of battles around civil rights, the war on poverty, he combined mind and heart to observe in one of his most memorable quotes. What we have before us are some breathtaking opportunities disguised as insoluble problems. Breathtaking opportunities disguised as insoluble problems. He applied his tough-minded optimism to analysis of big social issues, and he saw the problems clearly, but he urged us to action and hope. And in applying both his mind and heart, he spoke to our minds and hearts. So that combination of mind and heart spoke to me in 1997 when my phone rang at the Packard Foundation. Picked it up, and there was John. We had met briefly at a conference, and he was calling me in my role as a grant maker at the foundation. He wanted me to know about one of the efforts that he was most excited about, Experience Corps, which you've heard Joanne and Mark speak about. In that phone call way back in 1997, he talked to me about the demographic bulge of the baby boomers and how they would soon be reaching their 60s. He said at the time there were 30 million Americans over the age of 65, but that number would obviously keep growing. He talked about the imbalance that could result in society if this growing population felt disengaged from community, disengaged from families, and shaped the policy and politics of the country from that stance of disengagement. He talked about the needs of youth and the problems faced in the educational system. Yes, he did see the problems. But in that phone call, he also talked about the opportunity to tap into the time and resources and commitment of older people. He talked about the idea of Experience Corps, which he had actually, I think, first wrote a little concept paper about while he was Secretary of HEW. He talked about how this vast reservoir of older people could really enrich the lives of youth and be great supports to children and their families. I love how he ended that article or the op-ed that you mentioned, Mark, because he said, when older people have the chance to play the active and honored role that they deserve and the nation needs, the role that we deserve, to be of service, to be giving back, the nation needs, that when that happens, children and youth and their families will flourish. So in that phone call, it started a long journey for me, where he had seen the problems, he spoke from the mind, he also spoke from the heart, and he really did move my heart as well. In fact, for my entire adult life, I had been driven by the belief that every child deserves a strong start in this country. It's why I went to law school. It's why I worked for a nonprofit organization when I got out of law school. It's why I left a partnership in a private law practice in Los Angeles to join the Packard Foundation and become a program officer to make grants. And so when John talked about how could you match up this great reservoir of talent of older people to the benefit of young children and their families, it spoke to me. Of course, one of the best things about that call was that I got to meet many times with John and Mark and was in on the early days of the founding of Civic Ventures. And I'm glad to say I never had to ride with Mark in his car. But you can imagine what a privilege it was to sit with two visionaries. I completely agree with Judy's introduction. two visionaries, John Gardner and Mark Friedman, as they began thinking about what this movement could be. So back in 1997, John had reason to be optimistic about the Experience Corps. Joanne mentioned going to see a new opening yesterday. Well, in 1997, Experience Corps was in fewer than 10 cities, and today it's in over 20 and growing. We're probably 22 or 23 now, serving over 27,000 kids per year. He also knew that the resource of older people was going to keep growing. As I mentioned, in 1997, there were 30 million people over the age of 65. Today, that has grown to 46 million. So there was a lot of potential. But over these same 17 years since 1997, much has happened to me as an individual. And John did speak to us, both as individuals as well as a society. I'm no longer 44. When he called me in 1997, I was 44, had 2 young children, working a full-time job, and life was really busy. Today I'm 61, and like so many of you, there are many transitions in my life. They're all around me. Just in the last 3 months, I experienced 3 of them and celebrated 3 of them with members of my family. In August, I dropped my youngest child off at college. 2 weeks ago, I helped my oldest daughter find her first apartment in San Francisco, where she began her first real job last week. And just 3 weeks ago, I celebrated with my father his 90th birthday. So I'm sure it's true for each of you, as for me, that as we go through these transitions with the people we love, it focuses us on our own transitions. So both those events in my family and also Mark's invitation gets me to focus on my own. Don't get me wrong, I'm still fully engaged as president of the Packard Foundation. And Joanne, I really liked your remarks because I've served as in 10 years in that role. And we're celebrating our 50th anniversary as a foundation. And I know that the Packard family and I very much believe that when people have that kind of tenure in an organization, you do become very important as keepers and translators and transmitters of the culture of the organization. But as John says, I am very much aware of the passage of time, and I am thinking about my own transitions, and I certainly don't want you, Mark, to have to worry too much about me as I do that. So as I do face these next decades, I know that the transition is a fact of life, but it really can be a joyous fact at that. And so I want to read to you some of John's words about life's journey. Life is an endless unfolding, and if we wish it to be, an endless process of self-discovery, an endless and unpredictable dialogue between our potentialities and the life situations in which we find ourselves. By potentialities, I mean not just intellectual gifts, but the full range of one's capacities for learning, sensing, wondering, understanding, loving, and aspiring. So I'm grateful as I stand on the threshold of my own Encore that Civic Ventures and Encore over these past 17 years have developed so many wonderful resources and guides and a movement to help us think about how to tap into those potentialities that John mentioned and saw as part of our life journey. Indeed, I'm remembering another story that John would tell about his mother, who must have been quite a woman. I really wish I would have met her. But he told the story about when in his early 60s he had left Common Cause and wasn't sure what he was going to do next. So he called up his mother, who was then in her 80s, and said, "Mother, I don't know what I'm going to do tomorrow or the next year." And she said to him, "Johnny, you need a 20-year plan." So he did live to the age of 89, and he often said his mother gave very good advice. So I say, let's take it. I need a 20-year plan, you need a 20-year plan, and in devising these and living his legacy, we need to deploy both our minds and our hearts to developing those plans, to be clear-eyed and tough-minded, but also rooted in hope and optimism. But John would remind us here today that it is not only individuals who need 20-year plans or who need to take time to refresh and to renew and to rethink, but it's also organizations and communities and societies. Indeed, the idea of Experience Corps, of tapping into that rich reservoir of older people to the benefit of children and youth, is an idea that has so much more to offer going forward. In 1997, John saw the problem clearly and asked, what if? We need to ask that question anew. As I think back to this phone conversation, I can almost hear him saying to me, Carol, we know that aging can be full of challenges and that an aging society can present many challenges. But what if we tapped into that reservoir of older people really to the benefit of children and youth? We need to ask that question again today and refresh our 20-year plan. Let's imagine together. So the Packard Foundation focuses on children birth to 5. And when we look at the experience of young children in our country, we know we see many, many problems. But in the spirit of John, we see breathtaking opportunities. Let's ask, what if? We know that in those first 5 years of life, we know more than we ever have before, the incredible brain development that occurs in those first 3 years, and how it doesn't just occur on its own. It requires rich interactions with adults, and that many children in our country don't receive those, and that millions of children enter kindergarten from environments where they haven't had those rich interactions, showing a 30 million word gap, which has impact on their ability to learn in school. We know that. So let's ask, what if? What if we led hundreds of thousands of people from our generation to become allies to parents and teachers and communities to make sure that every single child experienced talking, singing, dancing, interaction to help close that word gap? We know that healthy development is so critical in those early years, and that health plans and American Academy of Pediatrics say that there should be regular developmental screenings. And yet we know that even in my state of California, 7 out of 10 kids don't get those screenings. What if we led hundreds of thousands of our generation to become allies to those pediatricians and those parents, to remind them about those developmental screenings, to help get them there, to help them follow up on it, and to make sure that every child receives a strong, healthy start? We know that home visiting is a proven intervention, that kind of assistance in the home for parents of newborns is not only effective, but is very welcome by parents who often lack the resources or the knowledge about raising and working with young babies. And yet, the vast majority of families with newborns don't receive home visits in our country. What if we motivated hundreds of thousands of people from our generation to again become allies with those pediatricians, with the teachers, with the community, to make sure that every family received home visiting? We know that child care settings and preschool programs are so important for children birth to 5. And yet, if you've worked in one of them or volunteered, you know that the teachers and parents, while doing their best, very much often face a situation of being under-resourced or simply not enough teachers in the room with them. So what if we organized hundreds of thousands of people to become trained to assist in those settings or to become teachers ourselves? And finally, as Experience Corps knows, we know that when children enter school being behind, without a strong start, that they stay behind, and that in this country right now, about 70% of low-income children reach 3rd grade without being proficient at reading. We know this. What if we mobilized hundreds of thousands of people to not only build out Experience Corps, but so many other great programs that exist that are working to close that gap and make sure that every child by 3rd grade reads. We know things, we need to ask, what if? Problems persist, we need to see them as opportunities and potential, breathtaking opportunities. The really great news here is that it's not a forced connection. Fundamentally, from a 50,000-foot level, there are rich human capital resources on one side of experience, perspective, knowledge, and there are rich, deep human capital needs and desires on the other side with our children and their parents. And from that same 50,000-foot level, we can look around the country. I could see them in this room. We can see a program here that's doing a great job, a program over there, a bright light over here. But there's so much more for us to do. We need to connect. We need to matchmake. We need to create on-ramps. We need to create institutions that help us move from these problems to possibilities. And we're just at the beginning of that. Stanford Longevity Center, Encore, and Packard sponsored a conference in July. The proceedings are available now about what would the opportunities be of connecting older people to younger people. And we know that there's so much to be done. It won't be easy, and we do need to experiment and provide lots of flexibility and choice. But again, the beauty of it all is that it won't be a forced connection. The fundamental truth is that older people are especially skilled at making the rich human connections that children especially need. I was a developmental psychology major, and my first class as an undergraduate was the ideas of Erik Erikson, and I didn't know how much they would speak to me at many stages of my life journey. But he was one of the first to describe the stage of life where people look of generativity, where people naturally look to questions of, how do I create purpose and meaning in my life? How do I give back and support the next generation? There have been decades of research since then. Laura Carstensen at Stanford at the Longevity Center is one of the pioneers, and it just keeps being reaffirmed that older people are especially skilled for making the human connections that children especially need. Aging is associated with more positive and balanced emotional experience, with seeing good more than bad. Older people have a tendency to live in the present, just as children do. Older people put a high priority on emotionally satisfying, rich interactions and focusing on the people they love and wanting to make a difference in other people's lives. Children are waiting for that. Children crave and they thrive with human, rich, one-to-one interactions. Their parents and teachers could really use allies who are focused on nurturing the next generation rather than worrying about the next stage in their career. So ours is not a manufactured optimism. It is a tough-minded one. The solution is in plain sight. Last week, I was honored to spend some time with Secretary Arnie Duncan talking about early childhood education. A group of California leaders were there. California has done a lot to improve services and outcomes for children birth to 5. We all cited important facts and figures about the great work that had been done and yet the work that was yet to be done. But the person who really spoke to me was a rabbi who stood up and said, all of this is important, but my hope is that synagogues and churches could work in our communities to improve early childhood experience for all children. And he reminded those in the audience, policymakers and philanthropists and business people, that this work wasn't just rooted in evidence, wasn't just rooted in credible research, but it was rooted in the heart. He said, in our tradition, we say the prayer, V'ahavta, twice daily, and in it we are instructed to teach our children with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our being. We see our commitment to early childhood as a pathway to live our values with heart, soul, and being. Indeed, that is the breathtaking opportunity before us. That is our opportunity to mobilize hundreds of thousands of people from our generation to engage and connect with children with our heart and our soul and our being. So let's get started. Let's make John's legacy truly a living one. Let's be refreshed. Let's ask anew, what if? Thank you.